I want to introduce the speaker for the hour, and let me tell something about Dr. Nino. He is not only the presenter, he's also one of my best friends. And I'm so glad that he is here with his wife. Dr. Nino, he accepted very happily to come to present this topic and some others today in this event. Dr. Nino is a music director, composer, and educator who has taught at Columbia Adventist University, Northern Caribbean University, and several high school institutions in North America. He has written many musical arrangements and original works for choirs, band, handbells, and a variety of mixed ensembles. His works have been performed in the USA, Canada, South America, and Asia. Since moving to the USA in the year 2000, Dr. Nino has been invited for clinics and workshops and as guest conductor to several Seventh-day Adventist music festivals, including Florida, Ohio, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, California. Also, Dr. Nino has been invited as guest composer and conductor at the Adventist University of Columbia Choral Festival, Universidad de Montemorelos Band Festival in Mexico, and the Adventist International Institute of Advanced Studies in the Philippines. Dr. Nino holds a Bachelor in Music Education from the Adventist University of Columbia, a Master's in Music with emphasis in Music Theory and Composition from West Texas A&M University, where carried studies under the guidance of Dr. Norman J. Nelson, furthering compositional studies at the Ohio State University with Dr. Jan Radzinski. In addition, Dr. Nino holds a doctoral degree in educational leadership with emphasis in curriculum and instruction from the American College of Education. For his dissertation, Dr. Nino studied the dispositions of band directors towards the use of cooperative learning strategies in the classroom. Along with his compositional work, he plays the piano and has an extensive knowledge in music technology. Dr. Nino also offers seminars and clinics in handbells, band, choral, and church music, while currently serving as director of music at Highland View Academy in Maryland. It is a pleasure to welcome Dr. Nino to the Goldfield for this event. God bless you and welcome.
Thank you for the flowers. I truly appreciate those. I just want to try to speak a little lighter, but very beautiful. Reminds me one time when I visited Hawaii and visited with my students, and when we got to the airport, they welcomed us with flowers as well. That was my first time visiting Hawaii, and I was very excited with the welcome. Thank you. All right, before I start with the presentation today, thank you, Pastor Juan, for those long introduction. When I sent you the information, it was taken from a previous presentation that I have done, but I didn't mean for you to read the whole thing. Anyway, before I talk to you this morning, and I want to tell you a little bit about me, but I'm going to start just like in the Bible. In the Bible, people used to be presented or introduced by the son of or the child of. And I have to mention something about my father. He was a preacher. He is retired. I was born in a family of a pastor. And when I grew up listening to him and following to him from church to church. But what is interesting about him is that when he was a child, he lost his dad. His dad passed away when they were very young. And they were of a wealthy family. They were not Christian. They were not Seventh-day Adventists. And all of a sudden, the family situation changed from being a very wealthy family to almost losing everything. So that's where the struggle with him and his mom and the little brothers started. Well, they were trying to readjust to the new life. We are talking about many, many years ago. His mom, or my grandma, who already passed away, she heard about a church, a Christian church, and she started attending the church. Then one day, she mentioned to my father about this church, and she wanted him also to visit the church. So my dad went for the first time to this church, a Seventh-day Adventist church. And it was a Wednesday night. They were having worship, and he went there for the first time. He was 15 years old, and he liked it. He liked what he heard. He liked the sermon, so he went back. But he didn't mention anything to his mom. Some time passed, and one day they start talking about how was the church experience. And he told his mom that he liked it, and he was continuing. But she said, but that's weird because I have been attending to church on Wednesday night and I haven't seen you. And he said, no, yes, Mom, I've been attending. What happened is that she was attending to an evangelical church. And by mistake, my dad was going to the Adventist church. But that's how he knew about the church, and he liked the Adventist church, and he continued going there, and he got baptized, and eventually he went and became a pastor. With the years, my grandmother converted to Adventism as well. So it was quite interesting. So the preacher in the family is actually my dad. I am the teacher. I decided to go into the line of teaching. So when I was finishing my high school, a lot of my friends or people thought that I was going to become a pastor. But I had an interest more into education and, of course, into music. So once in a while, I get invited and I preach as well. But the preacher is my dad. I am the teacher, and as a teacher, I'm gonna be looking at you as my students. So be careful, because I'm gonna perhaps ask you questions and give you quizzes. So now, with that being said, I'm gonna start, let me relog here, into the topic of today, the language of heaven. One of the responsibilities that I have at my current institution that I am now is teaching pretty much music. I teach choirs, I teach band, instruments, piano. I do also handbells and everything related to music. I love it. This is my passion. But I don't know why. This is very common in Adventist education, that when sometimes they feel like they have to give you a complete full academic load, and besides my 5 classes that I had, they were thinking that I could teach 2 more classes, and they gave me 2 more classes to teach in Spanish. I don't know why they thought that I could teach Spanish, because when I went to school, I went just to learn music. I do speak Spanish, of course, and I have been teaching Spanish for the past 15 years now, and I ended up kind of liking it. It is kind of a break for me when I teach. And looking at my students, how they learn, I became interested to learn as well with them. So eventually, I was more interested to learn more about languages. So when I teach them and I find things that work, then I try to apply those into my own experience. But the thing is that I already know Spanish, and I had my experience learning English. I said, well, I might as well start learning other languages. So I started learning French, and that's where I am now. So when I teach my students, I teach them Spanish, but I teach them the French word of the day, and I kind of teach myself as well. And we go there from lesson to lesson, moving from chapter to chapter. So in one of those days, I think the Lord sent me this message, and I kind of went to my class and I told students, I'm going to give you a teachable moment about language. We have been learning about languages in many aspects, but actually, do you know what is the language of heaven? And I started telling them the story that I'm going to start telling you today. Is pretty much how I learned English. First of all, when I was growing up, I was growing up at the Adventist college, and there were many times visitors, pastors who came from the United States, and they were preaching in English, and there was a translator, and I was there in the congregation. Back in the days, English was not very common in my country. Even today, you go there and you don't find very often someone who speaks English. Like many other countries that you can just go, like in Europe, you can go and speak English, and you can go alone in any of these non-English speaking countries. But that wasn't the case in Colombia. So I was there listening to the sermons, but I have to wait until the translator tell us what was the pastor was saying. And it was kind of interesting when sometimes the pastor said an illustration that was a little funny, and those who knew English, they laughed first, and I was laughing after. And I kind of was not very pleased about it. I said, no, I have to be among the first ones to laugh, because waiting until everything gets translated. So it was kind of getting into me the idea, I have to learn English. I have to, but I was not as applied as my father was, because he learned English on his own, and he didn't have to even travel outside the country to learn it. So I was going to do the same, but I could not. So one day I told my wife, as I was already married and teaching at the university in Colombia, I said, if I ever need to and want to move on in my studies, I am going to need the language. So we were young, we have no children, so we decided to sell everything and move to an island in the Caribbean that speak English. And we went to the University of Southern Caribbean in Trinidad and Tobago to learn the language. Our staying there was pretty short. We stayed only for 6 months. And then I found a job opportunity in the island of Jamaica, working at the Adventist University over there, where I was teaching music, and at the same time I was learning the language. But for me, it was a journey, a very interesting journey that took a lot of sacrifices. For many of you, perhaps you have similar experiences, that when you don't understand, we're trying to learn a new language and you don't understand something, or sometimes you are trying to say something and you say something else because you mispronounce a word. So it was an experience of deceptions, discouragement, going back again, and never stopping learning. It was a moment in which I felt like I have to do something to learn. The motivation was there. I had no one had to motivate me. I have to learn because I wanted. And then, so that's how I found the opportunity and move on. So in this process, as I move on, I realize that learning a new language is not only a factor of decision, but also perseverance. Once I heard that learning is not a race, it's more like a marathon, because you have to wait. Even though you study, you listen, you communicate, you have to wait for the brain to start processing and connecting all these words or this new vocabulary. So in that process, I learned to be patient. A virtue that was not much developed, and I'm still developing it in myself. But in the day-to-day activities that I do, the Lord teach me a little bit of patience. I say to my students, because my students are at the high school level, they are teenagers. And I said, especially those who give me a lot of trouble, I say, when I get to heaven, I hope to find you there, because I'm going to hug you and tell you thank you. Because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't develop patience, love, and endurance. So a lot of students who give me trouble, that is what I tell them all the time, because patience is a virtue that we need, and not only for the day-to-day, but also to be able to go to heaven. Perseverance is another important virtue that is part, or must be part, of any project. So, and of course, the spiritual aspect of it, prayer and encouragement and resilience. So those were elements that I needed to succeed in order to move on with the language. Then there was the opportunity. I had finished my English studies. I practically prepared for a test to be able to study in the United States. You have to pass a test. It's called the TOEFL test. And I prepared for it. Interestingly enough, this test was given on a Saturday. And so it wasn't given in Jamaica, where I was living at the time, because in Jamaica they speak English, so they don't test you in English. So I have to fly to another country to take the test, because in most places it was on Sabbath. And I said, no, there should be a way in which I could present this test in another day. So I found in Guatemala they were offering the same test on a Friday. So I flew to Guatemala for the test. Took me extra time, took me extra money, but I was able to do it. And I went back and I passed, and I had the opportunity finally to go to university and got this scholarship that I was applying for, and definitely it was very helpful. I'm telling you all these facts because there is a purpose to it that I'm gonna go soon to the next point. So recently there was one of my students doing a presentation about music. It was surprising to me because it was a chapel meeting, and she was asked to talk about something, and she talked about music. She was asking the rest of her friends and colleagues what was music, and there were a lot of definitions about music, and I was very well impressed how my students were answering. In most cases, they were giving the right answers, but none of them had mentioned my definition of music that I had in my head. So after a while, they gave all the right answers. Within myself, say, but I have a better definition, and they still don't say it. So I lift my hand and I interrupted and say, well, there is another definition that I want to share. And I say, the short version of it is that music is a language. And everyone was, oh, yeah, that's true. And eventually I explained to them in the classroom, because yes, music has all the elements of a language. As I have been becoming, not necessarily by my desire, becoming expert in teaching Spanish, but I realized that music is very similar to teaching a language because it has vocabulary, it has rules, it has grammar. In fact, when you study music theory, there are some countries, they call it the grammar of music. They don't call it music theory. So you have rules, you have to follow certain rules in order to be able to write correctly music. So the two of them are very similar. But what gets my attention even more is that even if we were not speaking here in English and we wouldn't be able to understand each other, but if we here would be able to play an instrument and receive a piece of music and we could play, definitely we would be able to communicate in the language of music together without the necessity of using any other word. Music can put together people from across the globe that they don't even know each other. Music can help, but the most important thing is that still music, even though it's a language, is not the language of heaven neither. We may think that the language of heaven is music, but it's not. Let's go to John 10, 3-5. And the entire chapter of John 10 talks about Jesus as the shepherd. And something that got my attention here is that in John 10:3 it says, the doorkeeper opens the door for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. But John 10:4 says, when he has brought all his own sheep out, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they recognize his voice. In communication, in languages, there is an important fact here. When we begin to understand, and I remember when I was in Trinidad, my first month, when I got there, I didn't understand anything about English. And even from the airport, even in the airplane, the only thing that I drank in the entire flight was a kind of an hour flight. The only thing that I could drink was orange juice, because that was the only word that I knew. So every time the flight attendants passed by, what would you like? I say, orange juice. So I drank like 3 times orange juice on that flight because that was the only word that I know. So I got to the university, I signed up for my lessons in English, and I started meeting new friends. And everyone was very welcoming, and I was very pleased to be there. But after a couple of weeks, I realized that something was happening. All these new friends that I was getting, they wanted to learn Spanish. So they were trying to speak Spanish with me. And I was teaching them, and I was correcting them. But I said, wait a minute. But I came here, I invested all the little money that I had and the time just to learn English, not to teach Spanish to my new friends. So what I had to do is start telling them, please help me out here. I don't need to improve your Spanish. I came here just to learn English. Help me out here. So I was trying to stay away from those who wanted to talk to me in Espanol and hang out with those who actually wanted me to learn English. So it was important for me to take this decision, otherwise it was not gonna be possible. So with all this being said, we have the motivation to learn. I had it. No one had to teach me, or no one had to motivate me. It was more in education we call intrinsic motivation. It's not like my current students that I struggle trying to make them smile. When they sing, sometimes they don't express with their faces. And one day, not too long ago, one of my students told me, Mr. Nino, why don't you just promise us ice cream? If you promise us ice cream after the concert, we are going to smile. So I wrote in a piece of paper, I draw the picture of an ice cream. So in that next concert, before they start singing, I show them the ice cream picture. And they were smiling or laughing that I remembered that. But that was not necessarily natural out of them. It was something that was external. But learning is more effective when it comes from yourself, when the desire comes from yourself. Also, as soon as I found the chance to move to Trinidad, I was taking the opportunity to learn the language. And then I realized that I have to develop some skills to move on with the language. But the most important one of all those were the experience. I would not learn eventually if I don't move and live there for a while and experience not only the language itself, but the whole culture, getting new friends and everything. No one else could really experience the learning of something unless we have hands-on. We could be experts in the theory of many things, but if we don't put those knowledge or concepts into practice, it's not going to work. I don't know if you here are good at swimming. There are basic skills that I tell my students, my teenagers, young teenagers that are growing in a technological generation. Nowadays, I get surprised that the kids nowadays, many of them don't know how to swim, or they don't know how to ride a bicycle, or even skydboarding. Recently, my brother moved from the city. He moved to another country, and he left for me a couple of things that he didn't want to take with. One of them, well, he had a small motorcycle. That's the one I wanted. But eventually he decided to give it to someone else. But he left me with an electric skateboard, which I find very nice. But my wife is always afraid when I ride on it because it could be dangerous. My daughter is a nurse, and she warns me all the time I ride it, because I like to ride it. And he said, Dad, you don't know all the cases that get to the hospital that we have to treat for people like you, that they were riding this electric skateboard and they get an accident and they come with broken bones, broken heads, broken arms. So she always warned me about that. And my students get surprised when sometimes I use it going to school. I must say, when I grew up still in the old generation, where we learned how to bike, how to swim, how to do all those things. But if nowadays, there's a lot of young people that don't do those things because they grew up behind a screen. And they may be experts, but just behind the screen, not in real life. But what happens if you are an expert in knowing how to swim, and when it comes to the pool, you get thrown to the pool, and then what? So the experience have to be there in order for us to really make it meaningful and to complete the whole cycle of learning. Hands-on is something that must be present there. Now, why I am saying these things, and especially in the concept or in the framework of the title of today, the language of heaven. Because as a Christians, we don't know what language is the one that we are going to be speaking in heaven. I hear sometimes jokes that, Spanish is going to be the language that we are going to speak in heaven. Other people say, no, English is going to be the language. And I mean, everyone would prefer to speak their own language in heaven. And to me, I don't know what language that's going to be. But I highly believe that it's going to be like an eternal Pentecost moment where we can speak our own language and we can understand each other. That's what I think. But there is an element that is foundational to this language of heaven. And here is the first question. Well, before I give you the question, I have to give you a review. In my experience learning a different language, I think that the self-motivation had to be there. So we talk about learning, and we have to be self-motivated to learn. But then we talk about opportunities, that we need to find opportunities to learn. Even right now, I am learning French. So if any French speaker here in the house, I'll give you permission to test me out and ask me a few questions afterwards and see how I'm doing. I'm curious. But right now with technology, I also decided just to take lessons with someone who speaks French over the internet. So I'm taking lessons with a teacher from France, and that's the process. But the third element was the virtues, or the skills that are needed to learn. And the last one that I mentioned today was experience. When we put all this together in the context of the language of heaven, we come out with this: love. And this is the bottom line that I was trying to get my students when we were learning Spanish in the classroom. We can learn anything here on earth in terms of heaven. But if we don't learn the most important element of the language of heaven, we probably wouldn't be able to go to heaven and speak that language. Because as important as it is to learn, more important is for us to learn this language. This language means learning the vocabulary, listening to the sounds of this language, practicing, reading and writing. How much of this do we do now that we are here on earth? How much of the language of heaven are we actually actively learning? As in music, we have to practice every day, because if you don't practice, there is no progress. I have had some students that they have been there because their parents want the kids to learn an instrument. A few years ago, I was teaching a young lady, and she was doing little progress. And she came back the following week, and the progress was minimal. And to make long story short, one day that mom wasn't around, I asked her, be honest with me, do you really like to learn the piano? Because, yeah, I don't know, I feel like this is more like a heavy load on you rather than an enjoyment. And she almost cried and told me, no, it's my mom, the one who wants me to learn. And I said, did you tell your mom that? And she said, no, because I don't want her to make her feel bad. But I said, but at the same time, if you don't like it, if you don't enjoy it, you don't have to pretend. Why don't we have a conversation with your mom and we just share this and see what happens? So she agrees, and I'm glad that she agreed. The mom came, and I explained to her that she was doing some progress, but not necessarily the progress that I expected, because at the end, if the student is not fully motivated in learning this instrument, it's not gonna take the students anywhere. Apparently the mom understood, and a month later they made the decision to take a break from music. And again, as a teacher, I can do everything possible to make a student fall in love. But if deep inside there is not a genuine love for what the students do with the instrument, it's not going to take us anywhere. So in terms of the language of heaven, how many times have you thought about being in heaven because you really want to be there? No, because your mom or your dad wants you to be there. Because at the end, learning this language is something that only happens because we want to. No one, not even this mom in Jesus' time, the children of Zebedeus, John and his brother. Remember the story when this mom comes to Jesus and she asks, "Oh Lord, when you get to the kingdom, I want my children to sit to your side, next to you." And Jesus answered, "Mom, you don't know what you are asking for." And this might be the same experience in many cases with music or with any other thing, that sometimes parents want their children to do the things that they couldn't do when they were young. But in many cases, it happens that those tastes don't match. But when it comes to learning the language of heaven, it's a different story. As much as mom and dad want you to be in heaven, it's only you, the one who have to have the initiative for learning, the one to have to take advantage of any opportunity that you have to practice this language of heaven. And how about the virtues? And how about the experience? Now, have you thought about your level of language of heaven? I'm going to call it like that for a while until we call it as it is, love. What is the grammar of this language? Well, the grammar has pretty much rules or guidances that we do for learning of any other language. I found very interesting that if I want to speak the language of heaven, I have to be careful, or I have to be aware of the following. How about this? In Exodus 20, we kind of have the rules of the grammar of the language of heaven. Because God said, if you really want to be in heaven, you have to love only me, only one God. How can we speak the language of heaven if we love more than one God? Being God the only creator and sustainer. God says in Exodus 23, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." That is a very important grammar rule for those who speak the language of heaven. Exodus 24, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, likeness, or anything that is in heaven above." So, no other images. You cannot pretend to speak the language of heaven when you are worshiping other gods and also looking at other images of other gods. Neither you bow thyself to them, nor serve them. You won't serve any other. For I, the Lord, thy God, I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers. I don't know if you remember, those who are married, when you were dating. I don't think that at some point your girlfriend or boyfriend at that time have to tell you these things. I don't remember my wife telling me, well, at that time we were just dating, so I don't remember her telling me, "I don't want you to have other girlfriends besides me." I don't remember that. Neither telling me, "I don't want you to have pictures of other girls in your wallet except for me." That wasn't necessary, because it's clearly understandable that if you are in love with this person, you are not going to be having more girlfriends than the one you are interested. But unfortunately, God have to remind his people, because the people was not getting the message as they should. And still, the Lord reminds us today why it's so easy for us to understand from the point of view of relationship, but sometimes becomes difficult to understand from the spiritual point of view. One important grammar rule is Exodus 28. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Because God created this special day as a special day to encounter with his children, for his loved ones to be together with God. I was telling my students an illustration. What if, I told my students, if your girlfriend invites you to a date, to a nice restaurant, and both of you know that you're supposed to meet there at 7 p.m. And then this young lady, she knows that she's going to be on a date with the boyfriend, eating at a nice restaurant. So she prepares herself, she takes a shower, she puts makeup, fixes her hair, nice clothing, nice perfume. But on the other hand, this young man is playing soccer, playing football with his friends, and when the time comes for the meeting, he remembers like 10 minutes before, and he rushes and shows up to the restaurant all sweaty, smelly, and he shows up there. I asked the young ladies, what kind of interest do you think this young boy has on you? If he shows up just like that, what message is he trying to tell you about how important you are for him? Well, trying to explain this to them in the context of the grammar of the language of heaven, how important for us is that special day when it comes after 6 days of work. How important is the Sabbath when God is there waiting for us during the entire week? He's waiting for us, expecting that we also take the time to prepare, expecting us that we also think about this special moment to have 24 hours of encounter with Him, because He made this day for us. He said it. The Sabbath was made for man and no man for Sabbath. I personally am so thankful of Sabbath, because if it wasn't for the Sabbath day, probably I think the level of spirituality would die out after a while. Imagine if we wouldn't have any day in which sometimes we feel like we are forced, unfortunately. But the bottom line is that if it wasn't because of the Sabbath, our spirituality eventually will fade out, because thanks to the Sabbath, the Lord knew, and He wanted to help us here to reconnect with Him. And He said, okay, this day is special. This day is going to be holy and consecrated for our relationship. If it wasn't because of that, probably would have forgotten Sabbath and forgotten God very soon. But it gets better than this. It gets better and better. If you plan to speak the language of heaven, you have to follow the grammar right now. And if you want to speak the language of love, you have to honor your father and your mother. How can you speak the language or pretend to speak the language of love if you don't honor your parents? How can you pretend to speak the language of love if you kill someone? The Lord said, thou shalt not kill. So it's very clear, and it's getting better and better. How can you expect to speak the language of love if you commit adultery? There is no relationship between the two. It's a very clear rule. How can you pretend to speak the language of heaven if you steal? Or if you lift false testimony or false witnesses against your neighbor? It's another important grammar rule that the Lord has given us. How can you pretend to speak the language of heaven if you envy your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's main servant, or anything that your neighbor has? The language of heaven involves all these grammar rules that sometimes we might think that if we just follow these rules, we are just done and we are ready to go to heaven. But it's not that simple. We need to have the willingness to learn it. We need to find and look at the opportunities that the Lord gave us to learn it. And in this process, sometimes the Lord, trying to teach us, He sends us these opportunities. They are camouflage in ways that sometimes we don't understand. And sometimes they might come as problems, as challenges or difficulties. But what we don't see sometimes is that those are opportunities for us to learn this language. Those are opportunities for us to develop the virtues and the skills that we need. And the Apostle Paul have it very clear. in 1 Corinthians 13. And he said, if I speak with the tongues of men or angels, but I have no love, I become a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. This verse in 1 Corinthians 13:1 says it all. It talks about language. It talks about love. It talks about music. And it talks about the meaning of these musical instruments in general. But the most important of all those is love. So we could know all the theory. We could know, be very well knowledgeable of the grammar rules of this language. But if we don't have the virtues that 1 Corinthians says, and what are those? We know those very well. It says, love is long-suffering. Love is kind. Love doesn't envy. Love is not, doesn't vaunted. It's not pride. It doesn't behave selfishly. It doesn't seek his own. It's not provoked. Love is righteousness. It rejoices in truth. Those are the virtues of the language of heaven that we need, and we need the experience. We need the practice. How are we gonna be learning this language if we don't practice it? We have to make an effort to practice, to have hands-on. And it's difficult. This is difficult because sometimes the Lord sends us experiences, sends us opportunities to practice this language of heaven, and sometimes we miss it. I remember one time when I was in Jamaica, we were living in an apartment in the second floor. And there was no car garage, so we have to park the car in front of the apartment. And there was this homeless guy. He was a middle-aged guy who started passing by the house kind of at noon during lunchtime. So, and he had this particular way to call the attention. He didn't knock at the door, so he shouted from outside, "Hello, hello." So the first time I just look out through the window, "Oh, do you have something for me?" So one day I gave him some money, but then he started to come more often. So there was one of these days that I was not in the best mood, and my virtues were not probably shaped up in the best way, but still was a time that the Lord wanted me to learn how to grow in the language of heaven. So then I came with my wife, and we were just having lunch when I hear his voice again through the parking lot. "Hello," and I said, "Not again. This guy, I'm going to ignore him this time." And I tried to continue with my lunch. But the car was there, and he knew that as long as the car was there, we were there. So he didn't stop, and he kept on calling. And the more he called, the more my lunch was really being messed up, because I was not easy on that. And I was getting a little upset. And finally I finished lunch, and I said, "Okay, well, this time I'm not going to give him money. I'm just going to give him something to eat. Why should I give him money all the time?" And he's getting used to that. So, but I was not in my best mood to do that. So when we were ready to leave, I grabbed a bag, and I have a couple of oranges, and I put like 3 oranges in the bag. And as soon as we walk out the stairs, the house, he was there, and and I grabbed the bag, and I just passed through him and said, here you go. And I kept walking to my car. And this guy grabbed the bag with the oranges, and he looked at it, and he said, only that? And I was more upset. I said, yes, only that. And I kept walking. So, but before I got to my car, he said something that threw me out. He said, okay. And that was like a knife cutting my heart, because I thought he was going to be mad. I thought he was going to be upset, but he just did the opposite. And he said, okay, and I was it was really cutting my heart. And my wife got in the car, and I got into the steering wheel, and I have to process that. And I said, oh no, Lord, why you put me through this? I started driving back to college, and I could not get out of my head his response. It was very painful. When I was expecting for him to throw me back those oranges, he just said a nice word. So the following days, I was just waiting for him. But he never came back. I didn't see him anymore. So after a few months, we moved to another house. And every time I heard someone outside calling, I thought it was him. But I never see him again. In fact, because of that, sometimes someone came to my house knocking and calling hello, and I went so quickly to see if he was there for me to make it up and say I'm sorry, but it wasn't him. It was the Mormons. They were at my house, so I opened the door, and they were the Mormons. So I have to welcome them, be nice to them, and we had kind of a dual Bible study one time at my house with them. So these are sometimes, and how many experiences we would have in our life that the Lord sent us for us to be practical in the language of heaven. Because the time will come that only those who really have the willingness to learn, to have taken advantage of the opportunities to learn, who have developed the virtues, and who have experienced and put into practice are the ones who are going to receive the award in heaven. So if we want to experience and enjoy all the blessings that the Lord have prepared for us, John 14 says, I'm going to prepare a place for you. If it wasn't so, I wouldn't tell you. But when did Jesus said that? Almost 2,000 years ago. If the Lord took 6 days to create the things in the world, and on the 7th day he rested, do you think, or don't you think, that this place that he prepared for us is ready? I think this place that he prepared for us is ready long time ago, and he is just waiting for every one of us to be ready. But like in my experience, before I moved to the States, I committed myself to learn the language. We need to commit ourselves to learn the language of heaven before we have this wonderful trip to heaven. No one is going to go to heaven unless that we learn this language. And the Lord have given us the textbook a long time ago. He have given us the opportunities to learn. And if you are here, it's because you are in that process. And we need prayerfully to continue developing these virtues and to continue experience it, to be prepared. So, how is your learning in the language of heaven? Are you letting pass the opportunities to grow as you speak the language of heaven? Ask yourself, what virtues do you still need to grow and develop to be a virtuoso in the language of heaven? You know that the word virtuoso is mainly used in music, but it has the same root. In the general word, virtue is more related to moral and character. But in music, virtuoso is someone who has a lot of skills in an instrument or in singing. Are we working to become virtuosos in the language of heaven? Is the language of heaven your daily experience? I hope so. And if not, let's ask the Lord to help us to continue growing, to help us to continue learning, because there is no other language more beautiful than the language of love.